Marxist teachers are indoctrinating our children using critical race theory to make them hate America, hate white people, hate Jesus, embrace a gay lifestyle. Something has to be done. Fortunately, real Americans like Governor Ron DeSantis are here to stop this anti-American atrocity with good old-fashioned McCarthyism. Oh, God. Oh, my God. I just can't I just can't take this anymore. Okay. Listen up, people. Let's just chill out. It should come as no surprise that this whole concern over critical race theory is just another scare tactic to stir up controversy where none really exists, in order to avoid dealing with very real issues and inequities that need to be addressed. As such a contrivance, the fake controversy over critical race theory is absolutely brilliant. On the one hand, inventing critical race theory controversy is a great way to justify increased scrutiny of teachers and professors, shut down academic freedom, and scale up state intrusion in the classroom, at least when that state intrusion is for the purposes of promoting a right-wing agenda. But there's a twofer. Drumming up a witch hunt against critical race theory also serves as a way to deflect attention away from the real racial tensions that have been inconveniently placed center stage by the movements for Black lives and anti-racism after decades of being pushed behind the curtain and ignored by both political parties. After all, Martin Luther King said, "Hey, how about we just judge everybody by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin?" And everyone looked up, scratched their chins, and said, "Hey, that's a great idea. Let's do that." And all of our racial problems were solved. Then those Black Lives Matter radicals came along and had to go and cause all kinds of problems again when everything was going fine. But the real problem isn't the persistent racial inequities that continue to plague millions of Americans and retard social and cultural evolution. No, the real problem is all these people in the streets have been brainwashed by critical race theory. Get rid of critical race theory, we get rid of the real racism that is being promoted by anti-racist activists because they're the real racists. And yes, that's exactly the argument against critical race theory. And now, as a teacher, a sociology teacher no less, I'm going to end up having to field a whole bunch of made-up nonsense by misinformed but sincerely concerned parents who may be afraid that I'm going to brainwash their children into joining Antifa or, I don't know, something. Oh my God. God. So I guess it's up to me to be preemptive and address this issue head on. First, let's deal with the actual nontroversy. You can see what I did there? I like that. What exactly is this evil critical race theory of which we speak? If I listen to the commentators on Fox Noise and other such outlets, the answer is simple. Critical race theory teaches children that white people suck, and because white people suck so much, America sucks. If we can just get rid of white people, America might be okay. Look, here's something I like to teach my students. If your initial reaction to a story is, "I can't believe anyone did, said, or thinks that," you might want to look into it because it's probably not true. If something strikes you as so preposterous that it's hard to believe anyone believes it, it's a pretty safe bet that nobody really believes it. It's not a 100% test. You still have to look it up. After all, we might say, how could anyone be a Nazi? Yeah, that's another issue. For now, let's look into critical race theory from the point of view of actual critical race theorists. According to criticalrace.org, a website for the Legal Insurrection Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing critical race training, critical race theory applies Frankfurt School critical theory to understanding race and racism in the United States. Critical race theory is, quote, an academic movement which seeks to link racism, race, and power, unquote. Critical race theorists, according to this organization, quote, argue that American social life, political structures, and economic systems are founded upon race, which in their view is a social construct. In other words, critical race theory posits that racism isn't just a matter of racist individuals discriminating. Racism is systemic. It is incorporated into our legal codes, our institutional structures, and our cultural norms and values. According to the American Bar Association, the term critical race theory was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to, quote, critique how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. Critical race theory looks at how, quote, the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. The ABA specifies 4 key principles to critical race theory. 1. Race is not a biological fact. It is socially constructed and socially significant. 2. Racism is a normal feature of society and is embedded in our institutions. 3. Racism is not a matter of a few racist bad apples that need to be rooted out, and racism cannot be confronted by colorblind approaches to race relations. And 4. Everyday experiences, especially the everyday experiences of people of color, are a legitimate subject of scholarship. Wait, where's the part about how white people suck? It's got to be there. I saw it on Hannity. He wouldn't lie. It's not there. In fact, the theory infers a very different image of white people. Sure, there are some that just are flat out racist, but often what you have is a well-intentioned people who understand that racism is bad, but are caught up in and making decisions within racist social contexts that they may not even be aware of. So, for instance, I may not be a racist personally. I have black friends. I teach my kids to judge everyone by the content of their character. But then comes time for me to choose a good school for my kids. Well, there's a history of segregation, tax structures, white flight, state investment that gives the predominantly white school on the west side of town advantages over the predominantly minority school on the east side. So where am I going to send my kids? I may not be taking race into account personally, but my decision is influenced by racist history, context, and social structures, and in making my decision to send my kids to the west side school, I'm perpetuating racism, whether I realize it or not, whether I want to or not. That's the world that critical race theory helps to illuminate. Contrast this with a common sense understanding of racism. Racism is the result of racist decisions by racists. I'm not a racist, so I can't be making racist decisions. There. Problem solved. If those kids in the East Side school can't get ahead, what does that have to do with me? Yeah, it would be nice if their school had more resources, but, Ben Carson was able to overcome disadvantages, and look at him. Look at Clarence Thomas, Barack Obama. So yeah, let's maybe get some more resources to East Side Elementary, but the rest is up to them. So maybe you think the common sense notion of racism is perfectly valid. Maybe you disagree with critical race theory and think there are other theories out there that do a better job of explaining the persistence of racism. That's perfectly fine. But the bottom line is that critical race theory is a valid and reliable theory and has a place being taught within the social sciences. To judge a theory, it must satisfy 2 requirements. First, the theory must explain the phenomenon it is associated with. In this case, the persistence of racism in the United States. Secondly, theories must have predictive value by which to test the validity and reliability of the theory. For instance, let's take a current issue like zero tolerance policies in school. If you subscribe to the common sense notion of racism as the consequence of racist decisions made by racist individuals, you might see zero tolerance as a reasonable policy so long as it's not being implemented by racists. If the rules are being applied in a colorblind way, then there's nothing wrong with it. Furthermore, you might think that if there is a disproportionately negative impact on people of color and the people implementing the policy are not themselves racist, then the only explanation is that people of color are simply more likely to violate zero tolerance policies and deserve what they get. But a critical race theorist would point out that there's no way to be colorblind when enforcing such a policy. The way race is socially constructed in the history of policing and disciplining black children suggests that we can predict that zero tolerance policies will have a disproportionate impact on black students, especially black male students. In fact, this is exactly what we find when we evaluate zero tolerance policies. Black students are disproportionately subject to zero tolerance policies, often for lesser infractions. An evidentiary review of zero tolerance policies conducted by the American Psychological Association points out that there's no evidence, quote, supporting the assumption that African American students exhibit higher rates of disruption or violence that would warrant higher rates of discipline. Despite this, quote, African American students may be disciplined more severely for less serious or more subjective reasons. To my knowledge, all civil rights advocacy groups point out that zero tolerance policies in schools are among the most significant, if not the most significant factor in perpetuating what is known as the school-to-prison pipeline. This is exactly as a critical race theorist would predict. In April of 2015, Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old black male, was arrested for possession of an illegal knife after running from police. Gray suffered a neck injury while being transported in police custody. He fell into a coma and died days later. Police behavior during the arrest was, questionable to say the least. Not the least of which was when they threw Gray into the transport van head first, allegedly causing Gray to lose consciousness. Was this another of many examples of racist cops violently abusing their authority on a helpless black suspect? Critics of this view were quick to point out that 3 out of the 6 cops involved in Gray's arrest were black. Therefore, his death could not have been racially motivated. Critical race theory, however, suggests otherwise. In a racist system, all participants in that system, regardless of their own particular beliefs, backgrounds, histories, are likely to be acting on racist assumptions. So according to critical race theory, labeling an abuser like a police officer as racist is too simplistic, a position conservatives often express. Critical race theorists agree. Individual police officers may not be themselves racist and yet may still be motivated by racial animus that is embedded in the system of policing. This is important because if critical race theorists are right, rooting out the few racist bad apples without actually confronting the historical, cultural, and systemic roots of racism is simply not going to work. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. I'm on team get rid of the racists, but this strategy based on a common sense notion of racism is only the barest start to what is needed. So look, I don't want to go into the weeds on the ins and outs of critical race theory. Like any valid and reliable theory, it has its uses as an analytical tool. It also has its limits. If you're interested, there are a lot of great resources that you can read and access. It's worth a look, but it's really a pretty complex theory with lots of nuances. That's why critical race theory isn't really being taught in any meaningful way below graduate level studies. Maybe some undergraduate sociology courses touch on it, but you're not going to see critical race theory taught in primary and secondary education. Wait, so it's not actually being taught? Well then, what the hell am I watching this video for? Well, first of all, what is often being described as critical race theory is really any curriculum or training that makes race central to the lesson and tries to make connections between historical racial inequities and current conflicts. Another practice described as critical race theory is any lesson that can be seen as negatively judgmental of America's racial history or can be seen as casting the United States in a bad or negative light. When these vague definitions of critical race theory are actually worked into legislation guiding school curricula, that's a real problem for teachers in social sciences and humanities. After all, teaching multiple perspectives and making connections to contemporary events and culture are foundational elements of teaching history or just about any related topic. The American History Association and other professional historical associations all list these very things as core competencies for any history curriculum. It's also confusing when we as history teachers face a public that wants us to be unbiased when teaching, but then we see legislation that requires us to teach U.S. history in a positive way. That's a bias. It may be a bias you like, but it's still a bias. If history teachers are going to be unbiased, which I would argue is impossible, but that's a topic for another lecture, then they need the freedom to address history warts and all. So take a look at this proposed rule change in my home state of Florida. Section B, instruction on the required topics must be factual, objective, and may not suppress or distort significant historical events such as the Holocaust, and may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. How do I uphold this rule? On one hand, I'm expected to be factual and objective without distortion. On the other, I have to teach according to a subjective perspective that defines American history in terms of universal principles stated in the Declaration. I'm not allowed to offer any other perspective. That's a bias, and arguably a distortion. The very sentence contradicts itself. So now what do? Well, it's hard to say. As a teacher, you just have to do the best you can. That's the way it's always been in public schools. The reality is that critical race theory debate is nothing new. It touches on a much larger social issue in the United States. Since the inception of public education in the United States, an underlying debate has always existed on what should actually be taught in schools. Look, the very notion of public education is pretty tricky when you think about it. When we have children, we have a vision of our children growing up in a particular way, growing up to be particular kinds of adults. Oftentimes, parents invest a lot of time and energy into teaching their children the norms and values that they hold dear in the hope that their children will grow and develop according to those values. So when we send our kids to school, we are, in a way, taking a pretty big risk. Our kids are taken out of our hands for most of the day and given over to other adults who are tasked with teaching them. Yes, they're supposed to teach reading and writing and math, but we know that teachers teach so much more. Our biggest fear as parents is that our children are going to be placed in the hands of teachers or school systems that are going to teach them bad stuff. We fear that they're going to be taught things that contradict the values that we want our children to embrace. Schools become a potential source of what we can call dangerous knowledge. That is, knowledge that may contradict moral standards and encourage people to turn their backs on established values. That's why schools are always ground zero for major debates when a society is in the midst of a paradigm shift. One iconic example of this was taking place in the 1920s. The 20s was a time of significant change in a rapidly modernizing United States. Traditional Victorian and Protestant values were being challenged by cynicism resulting from World War I, as well as the accelerating scientific and technological advancements that were pulling the world into the modern age. To the more conservative public looking at flappers and outrageous Hollywood movies, their children listening to sexually suggestive jazz music, it sure seemed that the beliefs they held dear were coming to an end, and the nation would surely descend into a state of godless anarchy, like France. In 1925, the incarnation of this descent into anarchy was teacher John T. Scopes of Dayton, Tennessee. See, at the time, a movement led by the populist icon William Jennings Bryan was successful in helping states pass legislation making it illegal to teach Darwinian evolution in public schools. One such state was Tennessee, with a statute stating, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and all other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals." The theory of evolution was low-hanging fruit on this growing tree of modernism. Here was a theory that seemed to directly contradict the Bible and taught kids that they were mere descendants of animals not far removed from brute apes. Traditionalists feared that this theory would lead their children to reject the Bible and really all human morality. They feared that it justifies animalistic behavior and could lead people to embrace the vilest, most violent, and promiscuous acts. And to be fair, the theory of evolution was being used to justify awful eugenics and forced sterilization programs. John T. Scopes, a teacher and a coach in Dayton, openly challenged this law by teaching evolution, and he was prosecuted. Dayton, Tennessee, much to the satisfaction of local businesses, became ground zero for the contest between the old world and the new, the traditional world and the modern. In this corner, we have the contender Charles Darwin. In the other, the heavyweight champion of this and every universe, God. It was quite the spectacle. A carnival went up near the courthouse, boarding houses were full, people showed up from miles around to watch the populist hero William Jennings Bryan wield his godly voice against the noted agnostic attorney Clarence Darrow. No less a figure than H.L. Mencken, the noted skeptic, came to report. The trial came to a head when William Jennings Bryan himself took the stand and faced cross-examination from the infamous Darrow. The cross-examination/debate between Bryan and Darrow was really rather anticlimactic. You can read it yourself from the links. The trial itself turned out to be a bust. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. The verdict was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court on a technicality, and the case was dismissed. The anti-evolution law remained on the books until 1967. The ramifications of the trial, however, were pretty widely felt. The media, largely reflecting the trends of the time, reported that Darrow humiliated Bryan on the stand. At one point, Bryan lashed out, "I don't think about things I do not think about." Bryan unfortunately died within a week of the trial, a tragic and humiliating end to an otherwise noteworthy and accomplished life. In the 1980s, a resurgent conservative movement brought the evolution versus creation debate back to public schools because, well, why not? When I was attending teacher school in the late 80s, I was involved in the debate on campus. I even wrote an undergraduate paper on the subject. This time, traditionalists hit upon a different strategy. Instead of trying to ban the theory of evolution through sexual selection, they offered a counter-theory called intelligent design theory. They insisted that as a theory, intelligent design should be given equal time in science classes, and since teachers are expected to be unbiased, they should teach the debate. Advocates for science, of course, pointed out that the theory of evolution was a valid scientific theory that had been tested, validated, and even updated with new information for over 100 years. The notion of intelligent design, however, couldn't be validated without understanding the whims and limits of the designer, and therefore was not a true scientific theory. In 1999, the great scientist and one of my personal heroes, Stephen Jay Gould, tried to bridge the gap between evolution and creation in his work Rocks of Ages. Gould suggested that science and religion should be seen as non-overlapping magisteria, because Gould liked cool terms like magisteria. In other words, religion can help people find the spiritual enlightenment that science isn't really designed to do. Science, on the other hand, is the best way for understanding the tangible universe. We shouldn't expect science to answer moral and spiritual questions. Yes, conducting one's life based on strictly scientific evolutionary principles might not be such a great idea. On the other hand, we also shouldn't impose our religious beliefs on scientific progress. When the surgeon is working on you, you want him to have a little more than faith that a miracle might save you. You want him to know the science of what he's doing. It's a nice idea, but reality is that knowledge isn't and really shouldn't be so constrained. Scientific discoveries have a long history of challenging belief systems because as knowledge grows, the inferences that can be made from this knowledge also expands. These inferences are then debated, and this is as it should be. It's not just about human evolution, but also social and cultural evolution. But social and cultural evolution is scary to the people experiencing it. There's a tendency to want things to remain the same, or at least to change more slowly than they are. Human beings do have a conservative need for stability in their lives, and this need is increasingly challenged in this particularly transformative period in history. We have a globally interconnected media and communication. Our ability to access information has accelerated faster than our norms for dealing with the overload. The world is increasingly multicultural and pluralistic as our economy is globalized. We travel faster and easier. Millions of lives are being disrupted to the point of pushing migration. We're exposed to a flood of new knowledge and a constant state of changing traditional knowledge. Norms and values that used to be binding are now becoming arbitrary. These changes are scary. And we can bet that this dynamism is going to play out in our schools. Look at sex education. A nice traditional Victorian concept of sex held that men wanted sex with women, good women withheld sex until marriage, bad women didn't. Any variation of that theme was considered immoral and even subject to legal prosecution. There was really nothing to discuss. If there was sex education in schools, it was to teach young men to avoid bad women and to teach young women to be good. You know, free milk and cow purchases and that sort of stuff. The actual mechanics of sex was something taught by the relevant parent and, of course, your friends on the block. The 20th century saw the lid come off of our knowledge of appropriate and inappropriate sexuality. Mass mobilization of young men during World War I required mass education on sex, especially for what was referred to as venereal disease. Hollywood movies and advertising campaigns were changing our concepts of sex and sexuality. The 1920s was a period of sexual revolution and experimentation. In the 1960s, the advent of the birth control pill and second-wave feminism challenged constraints on values defining the good woman. In the 1970s, activists challenged our assumptions about homosexuality, while the AIDS crisis in the 1980s revealed that sexual knowledge wasn't just a moral issue. It was literally a matter of life and death. By the turn of the 21st century, we had internet porn and an LGBTQ+ movement challenging our very assumptions about gender identity. And all along the way, we've had the challenge of dealing with these forms of dangerous knowledge as the revealed realities of sex and sexuality pound against our preconceived notions of sexual morality. So how should we deal with sex in school? We've now gone beyond the good old days when the parameters of the debate were between those who advocated abstinence-only education and those of us standing up for comprehensive sexual education. Now we have courageous young people who are openly gay and transgender and alternatively gendered in our classrooms. We have to deal with that. How? That kid whose parents insist on a strict traditionalist sexuality is going to have a learning experience when Steve transitions into Stephanie second semester. So should Stephanie be forced to remain Steve for the sake of the traditional student? Why? If schools and teachers are expected to be unbiased, how do we justify privileging the heteronormative student? There's got to be a debate. That's the only way to figure it out. One thing is certain. Trying to keep the debate from happening at all simply isn't going to work. That's especially true now when access to dangerous knowledge is so easy. Take, for example, Karl Marx. Yeah, our buddy Karl. When I was in school, I really didn't learn all that much about Marx. School curriculum was still largely shaped by the old Americanism, democracy versus communism standards of the previous generation. We didn't learn about Marx or socialism in any meaningful way. The most sympathetic treatment of Marx and socialism was that it was an attractive movement for poor people because it promised to meet everyone's needs, but it was ultimately a bad idea because it meant that the state would take total control of your life, nobody would have an incentive to work, and the entire nation would become impoverished. That was it. If you saw Marx on a test, that was the only acceptable answer. I wasn't required to actually read Marx until graduate school. Nor was I required to read anything by socialist or leftist thinkers, no matter how significant they were to history. I certainly wasn't taught that W.E.B. Du Bois, Helen Keller, Einstein, or Martin Luther King Jr. were socialists. This hasn't changed much. Movement conservatives continue to beat the drum against socialist indoctrination in schools, and traditionalist parents swallow this hook almost every time. It's especially an acute problem now that survey research indicates that young people are turning away from capitalism. According to Gallup in 2018, 51% of young people 18 to 29 had a more positive view of socialism, as opposed to only 45% who had a positive view of capitalism. This is outrageous. It can only be explained by all those socialist teachers indoctrinating our students into socialism. Well, if that's what we're doing, we're really not doing a great job of it. If you look at the table, you see that the discrepancy isn't really the result of a growing embrace of socialism among young people. That really hasn't moved much. The problem is that fewer young people feel positive about capitalism. Maybe the whole stagnant wages, unstable work life, mounting debt, and having to drive Uber after hours to make ends meet thing isn't really working for them. Regardless, the Red Scare is alive and well and thriving in public schools. From outrage over anti-Americanism and AP history courses to our current debate over critical race theory, a lot of this can be traced back to fear-mongering tactics going back to Joseph McCarthy. Movement conservatives drum up bogus accusations for a traditionalist base that their children are being indoctrinated. School boards, principals, and teachers then must pander by value signaling how unbiased they are by changing curriculum or weeding out potentially controversial textbooks or resources. Teachers feel the pressure to avoid hot-button issues or censor material like the 1619 Project, lest they be perceived as leftist indoctrinators. The truth is that very few teachers can be defined as leftists, let alone socialists. Empirical evidence on this is hard to come by, but one survey by Education Week shows that almost all teachers identify as either liberal, conservative, or moderate, with the largest group, 43%, identifying as moderate, and just over 20% for both liberals and conservatives. Only 5% of teachers identify as very liberal. If you know anything about socialism, being very liberal is a far cry from being socialist, let alone Marxist. There's one study of college professors from 2006, and we all know that colleges are just chock full of Marxists, and this research shows that colleges are hardly chock full of Marxists. Only 3% of professors identify as Marxists. It should come as no surprise that the largest Marxist cohort was in the social sciences, but even there, fewer than 18% of professors identified as Marxists, and less than a quarter identified as radicals. There's some suggestion that college professors are becoming more liberal and left-wing, but again, this does not equate to socialism or Marxism, and fears that students are being indoctrinated in any way, left or right, is just simply unfounded. So, the larger issue of wanting to protect our children from dangerous knowledge is nothing new, and to be fair to all involved, it's not unreasonable. Like my traditionalist and conservative friends, I also have children, and I also have an idea of how I'd like my children to turn out. Take, for instance, Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. I find objectivism to be a truly abhorrent, morally bankrupt philosophy, and the last thing I want to see is some teacher trying to indoctrinate my daughter into objectivism.
Hey, Dad.
Hi, Doodle.
So my teacher was telling us about this philosophy called objectivism.
No! You see what I mean? There are a lot of ideas out there, and what constitutes dangerous knowledge is pretty subjective. How do we protect our kids from dangerous knowledge while at the same time protecting the rights of students everywhere to maximize their potential and pursue their own ends as well-informed, critically thinking adults? First, let's talk about what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't ban the stuff we or our particular interest group thinks of as dangerous knowledge. Yes, I know, schools can't just be a free-for-all of everyone sharing whatever they want. The Holocaust happened. The earth is not flat. Our schools should be free of falsehoods, and teachers must be professional enough in their fields to filter out the blatant falsehoods. Optimally, they should be competent enough in what they're teaching to explain why they're falsehoods. Your history teacher should be able to tell you how she knows the Holocaust happened. Your science teacher should be able to tell you how he knows that the Earth is not flat. But these are areas of professional competence that, quite frankly, don't have to be subject to censorship. Any competent science teacher should be able to explain why believing that the Earth is flat is simply not valid. If they can't, then they're simply not competent. But banning valid theories like critical race theory or Marxist theory or even influential ideas like objectivism is not only morally objectionable, but also ineffective. Look, I teach sociology, which means I teach Marxist theory. I teach the strengths of this theory and the weaknesses, its application and its limits. I do this not because I'm a Marxist, but because I'm a responsible educator. Often when I teach Marx, the response I get from my students is anticlimax. They think I'm going to share some deep, dark, taboo, forbidden thing. When I explain dialectical materialism and the labor theory of value, I get, is that it? Why does everyone get so upset? That's when I go into some of the political inferences and some of the ways Marxism has been used throughout history, but for the purposes of my class, I'm looking at his theoretical framework, not the revolution of the proletariat. Parents should want me to do this because it's not like their kids can't get access to this knowledge on their own. Maybe from folks who really do want to indoctrinate them. In fact, from students I've talked to who decided to become socialists, one of the things that radicalized them was the fact that when they actually read what socialists believed, they realized that it didn't line up with what they were told socialists believed. And if they were being lied to about this, what else were they being lied to about? As always, the best analogy is sex. Like most students of my time, I didn't get comprehensive sex education in school. We were supposed to learn about sex ed in health class, but the coach who taught my required health class spent a bit more time on teaching exercise and nutrition and CPR, so we ran out of time for sex ed. Does that mean I didn't learn about sex? Of course not. I learned all about sex. I just learned it from questionable sources that didn't really know any more than I did. What could possibly go wrong? If kids are going to learn about critical race theory, isn't it better that they learn it from professional teachers, steeped in their field and bound by professional ethics to teach in a balanced way? Yeah, but Andosha, what about bias? You yourself have admitted that you don't like objectivism, so that means you're probably not teaching objectivism, even though it is a really influential philosophy that kids should learn about in school. And if you are teaching it, you can't be teaching it in a balanced way. Even if you try, your biases are going to show. The kids are going to know. And this is going to be true when teaching about the different political parties in civics class or the string theory science class. Even if the teacher is well-meaning and really tries hard to not be biased, the biases are going to show. True. But again, the solution isn't censorship. The solution is freedom. Specifically, academic freedom within the bounds of the disciplines being taught. If a student goes to the teacher down the hall and learns all about objectivism from an Ayn Rand fan, when that student comes to me, she's going to get a different perspective. Assuming the teacher down the hall is competent in teaching according to the professional principles of their discipline, that student is going to walk away with a strong understanding of the subject from multiple perspectives and may be able to make up her own mind about objectivism. Maybe she'll reject it because of what I teach, or she'll embrace it because of what the other teacher taught. Maybe she'll innovate the idea based on all kinds of other ideas that she's been taught, accepting parts of it and rejecting others. That's what education should be about. One thing we know for sure is, she isn't going to just embrace or reject an idea just because a teacher says so. Students are not blank slates who just mindlessly soak up the knowledge their teachers pour into their heads. They walk into our classrooms with nuanced histories, beliefs, values, orientations, and aptitudes. They've already been subject to contradictory information, and they've already developed mental strategies for dealing with those contradictions well before their Marxist sociology teachers get to them. Students are much more critical and sophisticated thinkers than many parents give them credit for. They're certainly much more sophisticated than Governors Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott give them credit for. So, here's a radical idea. If you really don't want your kids to be indoctrinated, there's one strategy that's sure to work. It's called talking to them. Mind-blowing. Actually have conversations with your kids where you share your ideas and values. That means listening to your kids, actively listening without judgment. Ask them what they thought about whatever it is that they were exposed to in science class. Then share with them what you think. Don't dismiss what they have to say, especially if they're teenagers. Do that and you can almost guarantee they'll reject what you have to say. But if you include your kids in a meaningful conversation about your values and even your concerns, they might just listen. They may not agree. Again, they're going to be just as critical with you, their parent, as they are with me, their teacher, if not more so. And for my students, if your parent wants to share their values with you, listen. They may actually have something to teach you. If you're concerned about something that your teachers taught you or taught your child, please don't email Ron DeSantis and try to ban whatever dangerous knowledge you're worried about. Try this first. Talk to the teacher. Chances are really pretty good that the teacher isn't trying to indoctrinate your kids. Establishing a healthy and respectful dialogue with the teacher will almost certainly make you more comfortable with what they're teaching and why they're teaching it. It will also allay concerns when what the teacher is teaching conflicts with your values or the values you want your children to learn. In that event, the teacher can probably find some way to help with the conflict. That's part of the job we've been trained to do. As a teacher, there are just certain things I have to do to teach well. I teach sociology. It would be absolutely irresponsible of me as a professional to teach sociology and leave marks out for fear that parents or the state governor might think I'm trying to indoctrinate my students. It would be irresponsible for a history teacher to teach American history without putting slavery into the horrible context it deserves. It's irresponsible of a science teacher to not teach Darwinian evolution. There are just some things that a responsible teacher has to teach in any given subject, and it's likely that some of that knowledge is dangerous to somebody. Bless you. If we just teach the stuff that's safe, our students can't grow. If our students can't grow, our society stagnates. Banning curriculum and censoring materials is simply bad policy. Look, here's the truth. When all is said and done, our children are not going to turn out exactly the way we want them to. They may become Ayn Rand acolytes or critical race theorists against all of our hopes. What good teachers and good parents should strive for is for our children to turn out exactly the way they want to. When we do that, we've been successful, no matter what Ron DeSantis says.